Hello, son.
Okay, and we are now live with the first podcast interview episode. And my guest today is Dr. Zahra Faridany-Akhavan, who is my mom. She is a scholar and a journalist, and she is an authority on Islamic and Mughal art, where she studied at Harvard and Wellesley and at Harvard under the two greatest authorities on Islamic art ever, Oleg Grabar and Stuart Cary Welch. She's based in Paris, where she writes articles in various publications on art history and gives conferences all over the world in art. So we're very lucky that my mom's made time to talk to us today. What I want to do though is start all of these podcasts with a very just simple question to everybody, which is, what is your favorite color?
I would say Persian blue.
Oh, what makes a blue Persian?
Well, there's another blue that I like very much, which is called Egyptian blue, which is more turquoise. But Persian blue is really what you find on the mosques, mixed in with turquoise. And it's almost, I love it because in the paintings that I study, it was made from lapis lazuli. And lapis lazuli was ground from the mountains of Badakhshan in Afghanistan. And so, and they call it Persian blue, which is it can be daytime and it can be nighttime. You can put stars in it. I think it really represents Iranian culture.
Well, yeah, for listeners, in case it wasn't clear, that my mom could cite colors to anything in the Persian art catalog, like there's your proof. Okay, well now, talking a bit more about that, were you always interested in colors like that and art when you were growing up?
I think I was, but I wasn't conscious of it. Now when I look back, I realize that it was because there was art around me all the time, because my father was a collector. He collected miniatures, and he also was the patron of young 20th century miniaturists. And he collected all their works, and they were, for example, Jawad Rostam and Mahmoud Farchian, Haji Musa.
These were in your father's collection?
These were all my father's collection. I have some of them, but then unfortunately after the revolution they were taken, and actually some of them are in the National Museum now in Tehran. But so he patronized these young artists that weren't very popular. And so yes, and then when after the revolution, when we came to
it's fine, you just go back.
But so when we were in England, he would always go to Sotheby's and Christie's as well. So he was always going to auctions, and I would sit and paint next to him, I would color next to him while he read his books and sort of looked at the paintings that he's bought. So yes, I never thought I would go into studying it. But I think it must have influenced me greatly.
Were you coloring in like coloring books, or were you?
Yes, I was coloring, but I remember I was coloring with crayon, and at one point he looked at me and he goes, if you polish it, he took a piece of cotton and he polished it, and it took a sheen. And of course, it was only decades later that I realized that that's what the Safavid artists would do. They would polish the paper with special stones. So yes, it was with coloring and watercolor. I became very interested in watercolor, and I remember starting to do a lot of watercolor.
Do you still do watercolors?
Very rarely. One of my regrets, because I left Iran when I was very young, I left at the age of 9.
What year was that? Sorry, maybe not to say that.
I left Iran at the age of 9, and that which meant that my schooling was only in the summer for 1 month. So my writing never got as good as it should have been. So whereas my English writing, I took calligraphy, my Persian script, the Nastalir that I study in miniatures, is not as good as it should be. So I took classes when I was in America, and also when I first went to Paris, I took Nastalir classes. Whenever I was in Tehran, I went to the Institute for Fine Writing and Jomana Khoshnevisan, hoping to elevate my handwriting in Persian.
Did that translate into studying writing in America when you came here?
Persian writing?
Was it always calligraphy writing, or?
In English or in Persian?
Either.
Well, calligraphy in English I studied as a child at boarding school. That was
Where did you go to boarding school?
I went to boarding school in West Malvern, Worcestershire for 6 years, and then I came to London. We lived in London, and I came to London to do my A-levels.
So when did your father start living in London?
Well, we had been living in London for years before, because my father was actually part of the Anglo-Iranian oil company. And so he had done his studies in England. He was with the company when he was studying as well. He did his PhD at Birmingham University, and then they went back to Iran, a handful of Iranian English educated Iranians, so that they could lead the oil company technically after the British left. But of course then we stayed, and my father would go back and forth to Iran, but and then we would come home at Christmas to London at Christmas and the spring, and then Tehran, Isfahan and Shiraz in the summer. My father was from Isfahan, so we had a house in Isfahan, and we loved to go there. And my mother is from Shiraz, so we would go to Shiraz as well. And my sister now lives near Persepolis, so the last time I went to visit her. I haven't traveled too much around Iran, but those two cities and Tehran I know quite well.
And not to get too deep into it, but what are some key differences between Isfahan and Shiraz and Persepolis? Are there regional differences that you can notice?
Oh yes, absolutely. Yes. The accent is the first thing. And as much as I like to say that I'm Shirazi, because the Shirazis are famous for being sweet and full of joy and love of poetry and wine, and actually very sort of almost an innocent souls, really good people, whereas Isfahanis are reputed to be cunning, and they have a distinctly different accent. And so you can always tell this one Isfahani. They are also they're also known to be very clever with money.
Isfahanis?
Isfahanis, yes.
Interesting. What is Isfahan known for as a region? Is it a industrial town?
Isfahan is known for, number one, for its beauty because it was the capital of Shah Abbas the first, Shah Abbas the Great, and so it was very much a place of trade, and of course the main square where you have the two mosques. You have the Shah or Imam mosque now, and then you have the small Sheikh ul-Lutfullah mosque, and then the bazaar and the Ali Rapu Palace. It's known for its palaces. It was very much of a trade city of trade with a lot of foreigners.
Was it ever the capital?
Yes, during the reign of Shah Abbas the Great in the 17th century it was. And it remained the capital for a very long time, and I believe it was after Isfahan that it was moved to Tehran.
So it's not unlike Japan, where Kyoto used to be is the ancient capital, and then Tokyo became the modern capital.
Well, before Isfahan it was Tabriz, but that was too close to the Ottomans because it kept getting, during the Safavid times, it was very vulnerable to Ottoman attacks. So they moved it to Isfahan to be more sort of more sheltered. and then eventually to Tehran.
What are some of your favorite memories growing up in Iran?
My most favorite memory, I have to say, is sleeping outside, because we would go in the summer. After the first, I don't have too many memories before we moved away. I don't have too many memories of winters there, but I do remember the summers, obviously, because we used to go back every summer until the revolution, till that last summer of '78. So we would sleep outside. They would set up mosquito nets for us, and all in a row, and we would sleep outside. And in Isfahan, the house was very, very big, because we would sleep on the roof. And so when I went back to Iran for the first time after the revolution, I asked my sister in Shiraz to set up the mosquito nets with beds outside. So, because the stars were incredible. I don't know now, because I haven't been, that sort of thing I don't think happens anymore, especially not in Tehran or Isfahan. But the stars, we usually didn't want to sleep, because you see so many shooting stars.
Wow.
Yeah, the sky was full.
Because it's there's not much light pollution. It's mostly the desert, right?
This is Tehran, though.
That's Tehran.
Tehran.
So even in Tehran, you can see the stars.
Then, yes. Now I don't know. And now there's so many skyscrapers. When I was little, there were all these gardens.
Wow.
But Isfahan, I'm not sure. Maybe you can, because you know, none of these cities were as populated, obviously, as they are now. But I will bet that outside still, I haven't been back in many years, but outside near Persepolis at my sister's home, at Charsor, I think you can probably see all the stars still.
Wow.
Yeah.
So when you would go to sleep under those stars, was there like a bedtime ritual that would they read stories to you until you fall asleep? Were they singing, or what was sort of the environment like?
No, not then, but no, but my mother would tell us stories, because you know, up until we were a bit older, but we wouldn't sleep because we wanted to just look at the stars. But now that you mentioned it, I do remember a bedtime ritual when I was little, which we loved. Again, it was in winter. And because we loved it, we'd seen it somewhere, and my mother would beg her. She would set up a kursi for us. Do you know what a kursi is?
I think you told me about it, but
yeah, I think the Japanese have it too.
Yeah.
It's a table, and underneath it they put coals, and then over that table there's a big eiderdown, and then everybody sort of sits around on cushions, and then everybody sticks their feet under, and you can either eat. But I remember my mother used to bring this enormous book of the Shahnameh, the story of Bijan and Manijeh, and she used to read that to us. And I remember the book being so big. And many years later, when I was studying at Harvard, I saw it on the shelf in the Middle Eastern library. And I was so excited, and I pulled it, and it really wasn't that big. It was this big, but in my memory, it had been enormous.
Right. Wow. So what kinds of stories would be in that?
The story of Bijan and Manijeh is probably is one of the romance ones that really takes place between the many battles between Iran and Turan. These are the main battle of the Shahnameh is between the Iranians and the Turanians.
Does every family have a copy of the Shahnameh?
Yes, absolutely.
So what does the Shahnameh represent to the Iranian family, then to the Iranian culture at large? What is the most what can it compare to?
They compare it to the Odyssey, they compare it to the Iliad, they compare it to the Arthurian legends, but none of those are the lifeline of a culture like the Shahnameh is. The Shahnameh, everyone finds some link to it. It is stories, it's mythical, it's heroic, so like all the other foreign legends that we have, but Iranians are so proud of it. It is, to them, it's the essence of their being. and they relate to it all, whether it's a bad king or a good king or a hero or magic or the wars and foreigners invading Iran. And so many have been copied, painted, and then reprinted. You'll be surprised how many of the more contemporary artists, modern artists, do they reprint the Shahnameh with the text that hasn't really changed, but with different paintings. So I would say it is the soul. I think if you ask it, as much as we relate to Persepolis architecturally as a representation of Iran, the Shahnameh, I would say, encapsulates how every Iranian sees themselves or even aspires to.
So when it came time, how soon did you know that you wanted to study it to the degree that you did?
Well, I didn't, because, again, unfortunately, I would see the Shahnameh in book form as the Bijan and Manije, but that would have been a printed version. So as far as I was concerned, it was a big fairy tale book with pictures. So it was only years and years later, not even before, I think when I was doing my master's, when I first started studying with Stuart, Cary, Welch, that I put it all together, because I'd seen paintings, but often the paintings have been separated from the original book. And so probably the first Shahnameh that did fascinate me was the Shahnameh of Shah Tahmasb. Cary had been working on it, he'd just finished working on it, and so he used a lot, we worked on it a lot in class as well. But
these are, what you're talking about is an a more artistic version, a painting version of the Shahnameh. These weren't printed editions. These were works of art. These were folios.
The Tahmasb one that I mentioned? Or the Bijan and Manije?
You said there are many of a different kind, of which Tahmasb is one of them.
Yes.
So talk a bit more about that. Is there a whole series of painting Shahnamehs?
Yes, illustrate. Yes.
Illustrate.
Well, really, the earliest one we have is from the 1300s. It's called the Great Mongol Shahnameh, and it is dated around 1300. They might have been illustrated once before, but we don't know. However, there were other written Shahnamehs, just the script, but the illustrated ones were that we have is from that. But what happened, the reason why there are so many of them is because each dynasty, each king wanted to reproduce a Shahnameh of his own. Mm-hmm. And then there are several famous ones. For example, the one great one, which is in Tehran, is called the Baysunguri Shahnameh. Baysungur was the son of Timur, the Timurid warlord. And then, of course, the Tahmasb one, which has a whole history of its own because it was bought by an American. It was known at the time as the Hutan Shahnameh. Was probably the greatest Shahnameh ever created.
So you were growing up in Iran and you heard all these, you read the Shahnameh and you loved the culture, but when it came time to leave boarding school, did you know that you wanted to study art history in college?
No, I went from boarding school. In boarding school, what happens is that you take your O-levels, and then the 3 best subjects you do in A-level, and then the best subjects in A-level, in England that is, you do in university. I happened to excel in languages, so I had done Latin, English, and French. Those were my A-levels. I didn't even do art history for A-level. And then I took a year off, and I went to Venice and Florence and Rome for 6 months, and there I studied art history. So there I realized I wanted to do art history. So when I went to Wellesley, I first started with actually archaeology. I thought maybe that's closer to Iran, but it wasn't what I wanted, and I ended up with art history. I would probably have done something with Iran, but there was nothing available. Islamic art was very much in its infancy at that time. There was no courses at Wellesley. And then it wasn't until the end of my Wellesley, time at Wellesley, that I did a course on Mughal art. And then at Harvard, of course, there was my very first course was with Stuart, Cary, Welch, and Anne Marie Schimmel, who was a mystic and a poet, and so the two of them, he would describe the paintings, and she would recite the poems that went with it with her eyes closed. So it was just
wow.
love. It was there was no going back after that. It was just, I was totally immersed.
So how did you like your time at Harvard?
I liked it very much once I got specifically and only into Persian and Mughal art. There was a lot of my master's was also incorporated Middle Eastern history, Iranian history. So that was obviously very interesting for me, because I did not know that much about Iranian history, but once I started taking only Persian art, it was just magical. I loved it, and I took Arabic and I took Persian literature, and so my Persian improved dramatically, because my Persian was good, but not as far as literature was concerned, and so no, it was great. And then with my PhD, by then I was very much into Mughal art, and so my PhD was on the Hamzanama, which had been dispersed as well. So putting together dispersed manuscripts has become my thing.
And you said the biggest example, or the most famous example, was the Tahmasb Shahnameh.
Yes, it is. I mean, obviously the Hamzanama has been dispersed. A lot of them have been dispersed, but this one has had a most dramatic history, and being of the quality that it is the most remarkable history. And the folios that were dispersed, and then parts of it were given away, some parts of it were returned to Iran. So yes, it's not only the quality of the miniatures, but it's the history, it's its own history, dramatic history that is riveting and tragic as well.
But you liked the faculty there at Harvard. You liked how long were you there in total?
I was there for 8 years. 2 years for my master's and 6 years for my PhD.
What was the curriculum like? Did you have to specialize in something right out of the gate, or?
No. Well, the first 2 years for the master's was a variety of requirements, such as I needed a new language, for which I took Arabic, and then there was certain requirements, core requirements, which I did, history, literature, and then I got into the coursework that became elective, and for that I did mostly I took one modern art, because at Wellesley my major had been modern art, but otherwise I did Islamic architecture with Oleg, Grabar, and then Persian miniature painting, Mughal miniature painting, all of this with Stuart, Cary, Welch. And then the last few years I was in residence once for the coursework, and then there were 2 years where I studied in order to take exams. So there were the exams, and then there's a part obviously that you have to teach in.
So you started teaching.
I taught, actually I went to, and you have to work. I went to Toronto. I taught at the University of Toronto. I taught Mughal art, and I worked at the Royal Ontario Museum. So these are all partial requirements. But once I started writing my thesis, I was no longer in residence.
What was your thesis about?
The Hamzanama. And it's very funny because it was suggested by Cary Welch. And it was some weird theory about it. And I said, this is not a good theory. I'm going to disprove this theory. It ended up actually was Cary Welch's own theory. So it was a bit, sorry. And then Grabar said to me, Oleg said to me, I've always hated the Hamzanama. I challenge you to make me like it. And I think...
What did you hate about it?
Nobody likes the Hamzanama because
Why?
It's too big. It's compared to Mughal miniature painting. It's early, very early Mughal. And they're very, very large. They're enormous sizes. And a lot of people thought them crude and too big. And it didn't fit into anything. And a lot of it has been destroyed because it's been sort of scattered. Out of 1,400, only something like 250 survived. So it was in shambles. And so I reconstructed one of the 14 volumes that apparently there once was. But no, it was a very interesting project. And of course, all this forensic work, which has come into what I do now, which is, putting together the history of the Tahmasb Shahnameh, all of this was because of Oleg Grabar, because he had this way of looking behind the scenes for the reason and tracing everything. So all my forensic skills come from Oleg Grabar.
Wow.
What
was he like?
Larger than life.
Where was he from?
I think he was originally. I think his father was originally. I want to say Russian originally, but I think he grew up in France. So French background as well.
But your professors were mostly Western, otherwise.
Yes, all.
Did you have any Persian classmates or anybody else in the...
Well, the Middle East Center only took 4 students a year, and I was the only Persian. There was 1 or 2 other Persians, but, yes, there was one, but not in my field. Later in Islamic Art, yes. 1 or 2 had gone before me, but, and then 1 or 2 professors history were Persian. Mangol Bayat was teaching Persian history at the time, but art history, no. And in fact, I believe I am still the only Persian Mughal art historian.
Why is that, do you think?
I always used to think that the Indians don't really do too much Mughal because the texts are all in Persian. And then the Persians want to do Safavid or Timurid. So very few, even though they know about it, very few choose Mughal over Safavid or Timurid.
Well,
but for me it was fascinating because the Mughal school of painting is born of Safavid and Timurid painting.
So by this point you finished Harvard, you are teaching at Toronto.
No, I was teaching at Toronto before I finished Harvard. It was before the PhD. Yes.
So where were you living at the time?
Between New York. I first moved to, once I went off residence, when I went off campus, I was doing my thesis. So I would go to Boston every few weeks to check in with Oleg, and because Cary was there sort of to talk if I had problems, but it was Oleg that was my true mentor and advisor on this. He was the one that I met with all the time. Cary was by then not at Harvard, and so it was rarer to speak to him about the occasionally, he would ask questions about the thesis, but it was Oleg that looked over it over and over again.
But meanwhile, in your personal life by that point, you had already met my dad.
I actually met your dad years before that.
Right.
Yes, and actually, I was at Harvard, 86, when I got married. So, and then we moved to New York, and then we moved to Atlanta. So by then I'd finished my residency in Toronto and my teaching in Toronto, but I still had to write the thesis and see Grabar. So I would fly from Atlanta to Boston and see him. And then once I was pregnant with your brother Iskandar, I would fly in the morning and fly back in the evening. And then even after he was born, because the last year that I was writing my thesis, I had the baby. So I would fly in the morning and fly back in the evening.
So you were raising a 1-year-old and getting your PhD at Harvard in the same year.
Long distance.
And commuting from Atlanta to Cambridge.
Yes, I'd fly in, I'd be in Cambridge.
So yeah, walk us through what the average day was during that time. What time would you get up and what time would you get back home?
Well, first of all, when I was in New York, New York was all right because it was very funny because the only book that had been written on the Hamzanama was this enormous book, all in German, where the man Heinrich Gluck had written this enormous book, and it was his first study. But my German wasn't that good, so I'd hired a German lady to come and sit with me, translating the book as I wrote everything in English to see what this man had said about the Hamzanama before. So New York was all right. And then we moved to Atlanta while I was pregnant and then had Iskandar. So really the commuting was for about a year, yes. I would prepare, then I would...
the night before?
No, I'd prepare over the few weeks. Then I would fly to Boston early in the morning, see Grabar, spend a couple of hours with him going through everything. But I never told him actually once I'd had the baby, because he didn't know, because obviously the last few months I couldn't travel, so he didn't know. And then once I'd had the baby, I still didn't tell him because I didn't want him to think that I wasn't concentrating. And so it was only at graduation in 1989, when he was at my graduation, Nazir Bhutto was the keynote speaker, and I said, Professor Grabar, I want you to meet someone. And there was 9-month-old Iskandar. And that was the moment that he said to me, you don't need to call me Professor Grabar anymore. You can call me Oleg because you're now a scholar. You have a PhD. So that was lovely.
Was he shocked to see that you had a baby?
He was delightful. He came to see us when Iskandar was 2, and Iskandar had a whole train set up on the floor. And Oleg looks at it, he goes, "Can I play?" And so he got down on the ground with Iskandar and he was playing with the cars. With the trains. But you asked me how he was. What he was like was that you would go into his office, and you know me very well. My thoughts go from one thought to another. Mm-hmm. And so I would spill out all these different ideas all over the place. And he would listen and he would gather them all up and then discuss them with me. Perfectly formed, placed in the right order. And I'd come out thinking, I'm brilliant. I must be brilliant, because you never walked in there and walked out without feeling that you've achieved so much and that you're so capable. He had that effect of a true mentor. I did there was a big celebration for him in 1992 in Atlanta, or 91, when the Kuwait Treasures of Kuwait exhibition came to Atlanta, and he spoke and I spoke. But then I did a speech for him, and in the speech I actually wrote an ode to him as a mentor.
Wow.
Yeah.
How long was it?
It was quite long. It was.
And he was there for that?
Yes. He loved it. He asked for a copy of it.
So how did you get through all of the demands of raising a 1-year-old or less than or a baby and commuting?
Well, I was working on the first Mac, the little black and white ones, and I remember I was once so involved in my.
The original Macintosh.
Yes, the little black and white.
The first generation Macintosh.
Yes, and my office was Iskandar's baby room. So he was in the crib, and I was concentrating so much. And at one point, I was so much into it that I looked, and he had pulled himself up. So I looked, and I got such a shock because I didn't expect to see him standing. Because it was demanding, and I'd have to, and I've got somewhere I found recently, I had my program sort of to study in between his naps, but I really pushed to finish in 89 because PhDs can take forever. One, because we were now living in Atlanta, and two, because I wanted very much to meet Benazir Bhutto.
Mm-hmm. And you famously are not the biggest fan of Atlanta, and you mentioned you told stories about those early days being there. So what was it about the city that was it just that you weren't accustomed to it, or was it just too new for you? What do you think was the main reason of why it was such a culture shock?
The culture shock was that I loved it because obviously I love Gone with the Wind, and I had this sort of romanticized vision of it. But for me, it was not practical. I couldn't work, and I believe that, because I have not worked really, I have not taught in academia as much as I wished and should have. And by the time I wanted to come back to it, I had really skipped too many levels. And I taught for a while at Georgia State, where they had they opened a course for me, upper level course for special study, and they called it non-Western art, but it was during the Afghanistan crisis in 2002, so I did a whole series on Central Asia and Afghanistan and all the history, because I wanted them to see another view of Afghanistan. And so I spoke a lot about the Timurids then, Herat and Kabul, and obviously the Mughals who came from Kabul. But it was not international. It was a very lonely place because work-wise, there was nothing for me, nothing. Certainly the universities had nothing. It was just not in demand at all. The closest they got was Egyptian art. It was, I do believe that had I been in New York or Boston or somewhere else, I would have done much more in academia, which is why being an independent scholar has been hard, but I'm sort of trying to make up for lost time.
But you otherwise stayed in Atlanta for the next 19 years after that. So what were the parts that you liked about living in Atlanta? I loved the friends. I have such a variety of friends, very good Persian friends and foreign friends, and my southern friends were lovely. I loved the school where you were all at. It was the Atlanta International School was the best. It was a very comfortable place, and I did get into some of the things I liked. I got back into my watercolors, and I expanded that to ceramics. So I would make pots with Persian calligraphy on them, and vases with Persian calligraphy. So I did a bit of that, and I was teaching. Because I was teaching, I went to conferences. And I had so many writing projects, which are only just beginning to sort of coming along to the finish line now. Yeah.
20 years later.
Yeah, exactly. Let's talk about those. You're working on 2 books at the moment.
I'm working on 2 books, yes.
Tell me about the first one.
Well, it was not supposed to be 2 books. It was supposed to be 1 book. And you advised me that we're talking about, even though they are linked, they should be separate.
That's true. I did. Yeah.
You did.
Because the subject is broadly more on the history of the Shahnameh of Tahmasb.
Absolutely.
Which you'd already dedicated many years of your life to studying at Harvard and all that.
Yes.
And this was meant to be a definitive, comprehensive history on the entire context surrounding it.
Yes, absolutely.
But then and this part where I definitely want you to talk about, which is sort of the main event on it, which was the exchange.
Right. Right.
Between Arthur Houghton and the Minister of Culture in Iran.
Right.
And yeah, as I recall, as you were telling me the story, it became clear to me that there were two separate stories under the larger one that we were talking about, which was one was about the history of the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art, which is itself a fascinating story.
Yes.
And then the other specifically has to do with the actual manuscript.
Yes.
I remember thinking that putting them both together in one book would be too daunting of a task to try to weave. But tell me more about how you've been developing it and what your thoughts on where they are now.
Well, that's how I was, and I'm very grateful to you actually, because I could see that I was stuck. Mm-hmm. It was daunting. I was stuck, but I couldn't see a way out because they were so linked, and they were linked in an important way in that some events that were happening to the Shahnameh in the mid-70s were exactly when different things were happening regarding the museum, and also then after the exchange in 1994, which I'll come back to, the Shahnameh went to the Museum of Contemporary Art. Normally, like the other Shahnamehs are at the Golestan Palace. There is no such thing as having a 16th century Shahnameh at the Museum of Contemporary Art. So yes, what happened was that I start with, again, I had to give a history of the Shahnameh, going all the way back to its creation. And then my problem came in the 70s, because that's where the two merged. At the same time, and again, the one place that they merged was at the Shah and the Shah Banu's bureau, because that's where everything was happening. The museum they were buying modern Western art for the museum, and at the same time, Arthur Houghton offered 2/3 of his Shahnameh to the Shah. So the paperwork at the office of the Shah and the Shah Banu were coinciding. So I thought my story has to somehow weave together. And then later there was the revolution, and in 1994 it was exchanged with by then even less of the Shahnameh than had been offered in the 70s. But what you made me realize was that the history of the museum had to be dealt with in its own context, but with a small, obviously, a mention of the exchange. And then that part would pick up big time in the second book, which is very, very dense.
So to give as concise as possible summary of the exchange, what was it? Well, why was it significant, and who were the major players involved?
Well, what had happened was that the Shahnameh originally had 258 paintings, and it had been bought by Arthur Houghton Jr. In 1959 from Edmond de Rothschild for $350,000, which was an enormous sum at the time. And then he loved it. He had unstitched it so that he could take photographs and have it exhibited. And then Cary Welch had done
the same professor.
Exactly. He'd done a huge double volume facsimile studying it with the historian Martin Dixon, and that's what we'd worked on. By the time I was working on it, that book was in print. Unfortunately, by then, the actual Shahnameh was no longer in book form.
But go back, get to explain how that happened.
Well, this is one of the sort of core problems with this Shahnameh and all Shahnamehs is that the paintings are more valuable for sale than the text. And this one had so many done by the best artists. And so they always refer to Arthur Houghton as the vandal who tore out the paintings. Well, at the time he unstitched them so that Cary could study them, and they could always be put back together. So there was no question of it being torn up then. But in 1970, he donated many pages to the Met, and then to the value of $1 million. And the problem started when the IRS came after him to prove the value. Now, he had fully intended to give all of it. On his death, he had intended to give the rest of the 2/3 that he still kept also to the Met. Had he done that, again, the whole Shahnameh, albeit in folios, would have been at the Met, and it could always have been restitched. This would not have been a problem, restitching the whole thing back.
But why didn't he donate it to the Met?
Well, the IRS, he did. The first third, right. He did. But the value that he put on it was questioned by the IRS. So he was forced to prove the value, because also the Met had been having problems with people writing off things that weren't worth the value. And I think they valued all the folios, the third of those folios, I think there was 78, at $1 million. And so anyway, so he puts, so in 1975, this is in 75, 5 years after the donation, he offered the 2/3 that he still had to the Shah of Iran, but for 28.5 million. With the thing that Iran could afford it, they were buying so much for the museum because they were spending millions of dollars buying modern art for the Tehran museum. And the Shah said no. They said, we don't have it. And so he sold 7 at Christie's. And those 7 fetched more than the value of the declared 78. And then he didn't intend to continue selling, but of course, seeing the value of the paintings, he continued to sell. So over time, he sold more and more folios, quite randomly, but more by the famous artists, quite randomly. I think he chose which ones, and then he let the potential buyers choose. The Aga Khan, Cary, Welch himself bought 4. And so by the time 1988 came along and the last 15 were sold, it was 14 officially and then an extra one, there was 118 left. And Arthur Houghton died in 1990, and the remnants of the Shahnameh came into his estate. And his son, Arthur Houghton III, who's a dear friend, and decided that he would sell it as a whole. So they started to look for someone to buy it. Arabs, diaspora Iranians. And then he was told that Oliver Hoare in England, who was an Islamic art historian and an art dealer, would be the best person. And so Oliver Hoare had a lot of connections to Iran. He knew a lot of people from before the revolution. He knew Iran well. And so they started to try and sell it as a whole. And they couldn't find one seller, one buyer, they could not. And so they got the idea to see if they could sell it to the government.
Of Iran.
Now,
So now this is Arthur Houghton's son.
Arthur Houghton III.
Working with Oliver Hoare to find a new place for the last remaining batch of the Shahnameh folios.
Yes.
The Shahnameh that had been created in the 1400s.
1524.
In 1524. And...
For 15 years, it's a long period.
Right. That same exact manuscript by this point had been scattered to the winds, and there was only the 118 left with them, and the 78 at the Met.
Yes.
And the rest
were
by private collectors around the world.
Yes.
Where does the actual binding... Is the binding still around somewhere?
Yes, the binding and the text went back with the 118.
Okay, so to tell
but
us
the
how
binding is not original to the 16th century. It was rebound later on. It was unbound in Ottoman Turkey because it had been gifted to the Ottomans. So that's why I'm saying that had it been in one place, it would not have. The actual unstitching of it was not the big deal. It was the scattering. Because right now 60 are in different places, not all in different places. For example, the Aga Khan museum has 10. I think Qatar has 5. The Nasser Khalili collection has 9. So there are not just one by one, but yes, they are scattered.
So tell us what happened next when Oliver and Arthur Houghton III thought of selling it back to the government.
Well, Arthur, Oliver, they couldn't. Iran government had no money. It had.
And what year is this again?
This by now we're talking 1990.
Okay.
1990, when Arthur Houghton Jr. died, they wanted to. So from 1990, they started to look for a buyer. And they found out that actually the Iranian government was interested in taking back any, and this Shahnameh was on their list. And so they at this point, they reach out to the scholar Shahriyar Adl, who was friends with the founder of the Islamic Ministry of Culture and the Deputy Minister of Culture, Mehdi Hojat, who think that they can pull this off, but Iran doesn't have the money. So they decide that perhaps they can exchange it with something that is at the Museum of Contemporary Art, because there's a couple of paintings that will never be shown again under the Islamic Republic. And after a whole lot of back and forths of this one or this one, they decide on de Kooning's Woman 3. And then they put an arbitrary $20 million value on each, the remnants of the Shahnameh and on the Woman 3. And then after about 3 years of negotiation back and forth, they finally exchanged it in 1994, whereby, amid sanctions, Woman 3 was flown out of Iran on the presidential plane, which is Iranian territory, so not subject to sanctions. It landed, and then in
where?
In Vienna. Originally, they were supposed to be exchanged. It was either London or Paris, but eventually it was Vienna. The plane landed. The Shahnameh, which had been in London, was brought, examined, and then boarded onto the Iranian plane, so that at one point each of them were on Iranian soil, so they were not subject to sanctions, because and the papers were signed before they were unloaded. For example, the Shahnameh was loaded onto the Iranian plane, where it couldn't be touched by sanctions anymore, and vice versa. And the Woman 3 was sold before it exited the plane. So, and then and that was in July 1994. They exchanged it, and the 118 paintings and 503 folios 106 pages of text. The Shahnameh, written at that time, went back to Iran.
Wow.
And unfortunately, except for some exhibitions, it's not really been seen that much.
In Iran.
Yes, the best collection is the Met, because they have all of their folios, the back and the front, exhibited on their website, and every 3 months they rotate 14 of the folios. So for me, who needs the front and the back of the folios to reassemble the scattered ones, it's very hard, because when they were given away, it wasn't they were given away in sequence. Sort of painting number 2 out of story number 3 was taken, and then another one was taken. So each story that may have 10 illustrations, one illustration is in New York, one's in Iran, one's in Copenhagen, so that's what makes it hard to reassemble. But I have traced every single lost folio, I think, except for 2.
Wow. So what are your plans then to try to, is there anything you can do to, at least, if not tangibly putting it all together, is there another way that you envision the story, the Shahnameh being read?
Yes, actually, a very interesting and exciting project that we're working on with Harvard is to set up an open access website for the Tahmasb Shahnameh. And Cary Welch, when he was studying the Shahnameh, took thousands of pictures because he had access physically to each of the folios. And so that's where all my research that is very academic would be put to good use. And what I envision is that we set up a virtual and that people can go to the site and they click on the page and the description will come up, and then the history of that folio, for example, when it was sold, if that's one of the ones that has been sold, where, how much. And then in his books, Cary really only talked about the most famous paintings, the ones he liked, and by the most important artists working on it. We would include his work, but I would pick up where he left off, so that when you tapped on an image, it would give you the whole history it would give the story and the history of the page, where it is, and then we would need to get everybody involved. And at the moment, whereas the Met forms the core into which we would fit all the other pages, without the text pages and the high resolution of the Tehran museum folios, it's a little bit difficult to recreate that. But the idea is for everyone to have access to it, and
so it can live on digitally.
So it can live on digitally. It can be recreated. My dream is for someone to be able to sit and leaf through it like Shah Tahmasb did, and it is possible, except that it's museums and people have to take that extra step to give us high resolution photographs of the front, which they have, but the back, which is very important, because in Persian miniature painting the story continues, and so it's linked to the page facing it. But if the page facing it is somewhere else, it's hard to do. The challenge for me on the Shahnameh book is to to truly do justice to the story, because the academia part of it is so interesting as well. But the history before, the gift to the Ottomans, and then it went through Nazi spoliation as well. The challenge is to give it that thriller aspect that it has, and for it not to be bogged down with the academia, which is very important to it as well.
Yeah, that is a challenge.
It is.
So when it comes to the day to day, is it about still trying to locate those last two, or are you mostly concentrated on writing these books and getting the story out there, or?
Well, the story has been written, and pretty much I've reached out to everybody that I can, and I have a lot of high resolution. So as far as the website would be concerned, that's fine. For the book, it is written. I just have to, it's hard for me. Every word that Cary Welch said, or the negotiations, it's all very important. But it's to where to draw the line, as to when there's too much information.
Right.
So my challenge right now is that the book is finished. It's the editing.
Mm-hmm.
If it was going to be a purely scholarly book, it would be no. But it has to be it's a book for everybody. It's not just for the academics. It's not just for scholars.
What do you think people will like to know about it? Why do you think people would connect to these stories?
This Shahnameh, which I call magic, it straddles everything. It crosses several different worlds, and it's got a glittering array of characters. You've got, Arthur Houghton at the time was the chairman of the board of trustees of the Met, and you've got sort of the whole Iranian government involved. You have Oliver Hoare, which actually, interestingly, one of the problems he had the last few minutes of the last sort of few hours or few days of the exchange was that the story of his affair with Princess Diana was about to break, and he was petrified that if it broke into the news, the Iranians were going to say that, oh, wait a minute, we don't want this kind of publicity. So you've got this golden casket. And then who the buyer was of who bought Woman 3. David Geffen bought it, and then sold it to and then sold it a few years later. He bought it for $20 million, and sold it for $137.5 million in 2006.
Wow.
So you've got so many characters and drama going on, and to have done such diplomacy, clandestine diplomacy, in the middle of sanctions between America and Iran. And Arthur Houghton III, who did the exchange, was working at Clinton's State Department. So if that had come through, there was just so much secrecy involved. And I think at the end of it, it shows that the power of, I believe that diplomacy, the power of diplomacy lies in art, especially Islamic. With the Islamic world, that's why I think more Islamic art should be taught, because if people knew about the culture of the arts of the Islamic world, because Islamic art is not a term that I think is very, very helpful. I think it causes more confusion than explains. But art from the Islamic lands, I think the world would understand each other a lot better if they understood the art of the Islamic world.
Wow. So these days, though, what is, how do you like living and studying in Paris?
Well, Paris is great. Paris, again, Paris has been good in these last few years. The problem is I can't teach in Paris because I teach in English, and so I haven't been teaching. And again, Islamic art, if it's taught, it's the whole range of it. So, and my subject is Persian and Mughal miniature painting, and so I've been really just researching, and of course at the Bibliothèque Nationale. And over the last few years, as I was researching for the Tahmasb Shahnameh, I was actually doing major research on a book on the Shahnameh, the supernatural cycle of the Shahnameh, the demons, because there's all these stories. And so I'd been to Dublin and England, Manchester, London, all over in Paris, America, and I had all this ready to be published by IB Tauris in England. And then again, with production rights and which photographs, and then COVID hit, and I thought, I have all of this exactly in the subject that I would love to teach, and I have all this research, and museums are closed. Especially, it was really directed in two ways. One for Iranians who don't have access to all these Western museums, and the other for the West, who know nothing, very little, about Persian miniature painting. And so since last year, I've set up a website, a YouTube channel, where I discuss the Shahnameh illustrations. And I've started with the supernatural cycle of demons, but hopefully that I'm halfway through it now.
What's the name of the YouTube channel?
It's called the Shahnameh, a visual guide to the Persian epic. And I've done 14 videos where I describe the story that's being illustrated, and then I show all of the paintings, or many of the paintings, illustrating that story.
So anybody interested in the Shahnameh ought to check that out.
Absolutely, and hopefully, because it does take, it is very work intensive, and then eventually, hopefully, once the demon cycle is done, I will continue with the other stories as well.
Well, we'll look forward to talking more about that.
Well, thank you so much. I hope you were following the site as well.
I am. Nah, I mean,
Well, Yasmin has been doing the
editing.
She has been doing the editing. I sent her the recording and the images, and then she focuses in and out and does the timing. So she knows the stories very well now.
No, it's true, and we're all sort of just now catching up to what it is that you actually study. Yes. And for me personally, recently, I'd known vaguely the terms Hamzanama and Shahnameh, and I'd sort of seen all of your books and drawings and research, but it wasn't until very recently, I think it was this last summer, where I finally asked, tell me the actual story of what happened. And only then, after you telling me all of the history of the Shahnameh of Tahmasb and the drama surrounding it, did I begin to really appreciate how it really does, how that subject could really take over your entire life's work. It really seems like a because I became obsessed with it. I'm writing a play about it now.
Yes.
Because it really is full of. It is about so much more than just a manuscript. It is about human greed. It is about culture. It is about how we identify culture through art, and at what point we listen to our best intentions. At what point we listen to our worst intentions. It's about the difference between, and of course at the heart of my play is the relationship between what I would imagine, what I was dramatizing as the relationship between Arthur and Cary.
Yes. Of
seeing art as a businessman versus seeing art as a scholar.
Yes.
And how how when those two sides find themselves on opposite corners, it can be a very destructive thing.
And then the moment that they discovered that it was the elusive Shahnameh, they discovered that together. They stood in front of it. That moment that Cary.
That's the scene that I'm currently writing.
Oh, but it's also, as I said again, this Shahnameh truly has a power. It has is a magic.
It really does.
Because when I started working on it, as I looked at the people that were involved. Because again, obviously, Cary. By the time I became involved in writing the story, you know, I think by then Cary had died, and Oleg had died as well. And then when I was reading the story and I see Oliver Hoare, and I think, but wait, we know him. He used to come to our house years ago when I was young. And so out of the blue, I found he had a gallery still. So out of the blue, this is 3 years ago, actually 2018, May, I sent a message, you know, that we haven't met, but you used to come, and I hear you did this exchange, and I worked on it with Cary, and I want to write the story. Would you share your thoughts? And he sent me his unpublished memoirs, 130 pages of his unpublished memoirs about the exchange. And we were supposed to meet to talk about it, and then unfortunately he died that September. But then through that, I realized that Shahriar Adl was a friend. By then he had died, so I never got to speak to Shahriar about it either. So then I called his wife, Mariam, who was very generous, and she gave me all of his files. So I have Oliver's story backed up by all the documents that Shahriar had kept. And then most importantly, Dr. Hujjat, who I had met my first visit to Iran in 1989 after the revolution, when I was invited to teach after my PhD. One of the first people I met, I went to his office, and he was the director and the founder of the cultural ministry, and we just got along because he's a scholar. But then at the time, I didn't know he'd done the exchange. So 25 years later, I see his name. So I'm desperately trying to find him. And he has been very, very, very supportive. And then, of course, and Arthur Houghton himself, I sent a message off of academia. And immediately he wrote back, and we've met and we've talked. And so it's just people, the story wants to be told. It's a story that everywhere I have asked, people have helped.
And it seems like not only is it a story that needs to be told, but it's a story that refuses to end.
Yes.
It really is the never-ending story.
It is, except, and you know, for me, but I need to catch it before it takes, because, you know, as a story gets told by further and further away, things are created and made up, and inaccuracies get more and more and more. And so I want to catch it all before it gets out of hand, and you can't find sort of what was the truth, you know?
Yeah.
So, and to me, the one of the most fascinating things in the middle of all this is that this Shahnameh, because, you know, the Shah's regime symbolized monarchy. Obviously, they were a monarchy, but it attached itself to Persepolis. You had the 2500th anniversary. It was so completely in character for them to have bought this famous Shahnameh, and they didn't. And it takes the Islamic Republic, who abolished the monarchy, to save this Shahnameh, this history of the kings of Iran.
So that goes back to what you were saying about how this really is the unifying Persian emblem.
Absolutely.
That even the different factions and theologues and monarchs, as long as you're Persian, you identify with the Shahnameh.
Yes, and you know, and they tried very hard, because the story doesn't end in 94. You know, Dr. Hojat and the Ministry of Culture tried very hard to assemble all the scattered ones too.
Right.
Even trying to see if they could do another exchange, and it just couldn't be replicated.
Wow. Well, it really is an amazing
I'm looking
story.
forward to your play.
I am too. Once I know what it is, I'll look forward to reading it as well.
So is it daunting you as well?
Well, right now I'm about 10 pages in, or 8
Mhm.
pages in,
Yeah.
and I just got to the part where Cary and Arthur are at Rosenberg and Stiebel, and they lift the veil and they look at it, and then I have Arthur saying, "I must have it."
Yes.
And then I like I said, I'm playing with having you, the scholar version of you, as another character to talk about not just. So Arthur represents the business angle, Cary represents the scholar angle, but the character that is based on you will represent the cultural angle, the personal angle, which is really what it's all about. Is in the fog of the great business transaction, it seems that people just forgot the personal, cultural significance of the Shahnameh, and that really is the tragedy of it all.
Yes.
But yeah, thanks, Mom. Thanks for sharing all of that. That was almost an hour and a half.
It is. Oh,
Yeah.
wow. Loved it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Mish. Thank you.